Hey, good morning. I'm Carly, and I just want to welcome you to Dwell, where we are a family that's defined by the love of God and committing to giving it away. And this morning, we are reading from Hebrews 3, 1 through 6. Therefore, holy brothers who share in the heavenly calling, fix your thoughts on Jesus, the apostle and high priest whom we confess. He was faithful to the one who appointed him, just as Moses was faithful in all God's house. Jesus had been found worthy of greater honor than Moses, just as the builder of a house has greater honor than the house itself. For every house is built by someone, but God is the builder of everything. Moses was faithful as a servant in all God's house, testifying to what would be said in the future. But Christ is faithful as a son over God's house, and we are his house if we hold on to our courage and the hope of which we boast. This is the word of the Lord.
What's up, gang? Howdy, howdy. Welcome to Alamo Drafthouse and Dwell Church, man. How cool is this? What a weird COVID life that we live. Did you ever think that we would get here, or that we would feel more comfortable in a mostly empty theater, right? Like, that's kind of an added benefit of this. Hey, thank you guys so much for being here. Alamo has been super kind in hosting us, and so we want to be good guests as a part of that, and so just make sure as much as you can, especially sort of out in the hallway and in other common spaces, that we're not congregating there. Don't be hugging and kissing on each other. That sounded so southern when I said that. That kind of stuff. And we'll just try and be very, very good guests because they've been very kind hosts to us. Hey, the other just mini announcement. I'm sorry, I try not to do announcements during my sermon, but I just got to throw this out there. You guys may not have realized this. You may have thought that they were brother and sister separated at birth, but Jimmy and Taylor actually just met like 30 minutes ago. So Ben was feeling a little scratchy in his throat, and we figured it'd be safest just to not infect all of us with, anything that might be lurking there. We're hoping it's nothing. But anyway, Jimmy is actually from the Oaks Church, which is one of our sister churches here in the city. And they meet at night, and he was super kind just to hop on board. And so make sure you show your gratitude to those two guys for sort of adapting this morning. So those are all of my announcements. I must, in fact, actually start out today with a sad story. I'm sorry about that. I know, you're seeing plenty of sadness. I'm going to add to it. This is the sad tale of Uncle Take It Upon Himself. I don't know if you've ever met this guy. You probably have, even if you did not know his name. He somehow gets invited to every single wedding. And when he gets there, you could have planned this wedding for like months, weeks, years, however people do weddings these days. You could have a whole team of people who are helping you to make sure that it goes right. You've got wedding planners, you've got coordinators running around, you've got caterers, you've got all these professional people that you have hired just to make this one day perfect. And Uncle Take It Upon Himself comes in and sees this whole situation that you've crafted and realizes that there is something that he must do, right? And so he runs around, he's bothering everybody, he gets really antsy. You've thought of every single possible detail, and yet he walks into this situation as if this is just some party that you threw down one day, right? And so he decides that he needs to rearrange chairs. He starts getting antsy when he's wandering around. He doesn't really know where he fits. Midway through the reception, he's going to be on some sort of like self-designated mission to fix everything that is wrong in this reception that he perceives. I actually first bumped into Uncle Take It Upon Himself, and I'm pretty sure it's the same guy at every wedding. I don't know for certain. But I bumped into him at Bethany and Derek's wedding when I was in New Orleans. It was one of the first weddings that I performed. And in the middle of this beautiful reception in this beautiful church that they had planned for months and months and months, I see a guy, middle-aged, in a brown suit, walking across the reception hall in this like gorgeous old church, carrying folding chairs that we don't even know where he found them. Like, I don't know if he brought them in his car, just like prepping for this very situation to happen. And he brings them up to this table, and the best part was Uncle Take It Upon Himself is married to Aunt I'm not putting up with any of your business. And so he walks up with these these two chairs to this table that has very clear table settings, right? Like there's only 8 spots at this table because there are 8 matching napkins and 8 matching plates and 8 matching plate decoration. I don't even know what you call those little knick-knack things that go on that, right? And he's walking up with 2 chairs, and then he gets dismissed entirely, right? Because that is a total faux pas. You don't put extra chairs where there is not enough plates. So he gets dismissed, and walking back, dejected, broken, and alone, is Uncle Take It Upon Himself, carrying his 2 sad metal folding chairs. Now, I know that's a heartbreaking story, and believe me, Uncle Take It Upon Himself, though you may be sad for him, is actually the culprit in this story, not the victim. But all of that is to say, that was the longest possible way that I could work my way around to saying that the problem with this guy and the problem with so many of us is actually a problem of not knowing where we fit in. I mean, here this guy gets invited to a party. Weddings are like the most curated party of your life, right? You don't have to bring anything. You don't have to do anything. And still, he feels like in order to stay away from having to, I don't know, talk to human beings, in order to avoid that sort of awkward conversation circle that you're, hopping around from place to place, in order for all of that to happen, he decides that I have to give myself some sort of role. I have to give myself some sort of authority, some sort of responsibility in order to enjoy this party. And because of that, he ends up confused and looking confused to everyone that he's around. Now, that might not be so many of our problems, at least not at weddings, but I think to a degree, all of us are kind of thinking and feeling some level of this, right? Maybe it's to an even greater degree we're asking, like, where do I fit into this world? What is my place in this world? What am I meant to do? What am I here for? What is the reason why I have been sort of like put in this place at this time? Where do I fit into this sort of grand scheme that is happening all around me, this story that is unfolding around me? Now I know I took just the most ridiculous leap from Uncle Take It Upon Himself to an existential question that's at the heart of like so many of our deepest fears and concerns. But I do that to just say that I think there's like a little piece of us, and that same problem that would cause Uncle Take It Upon Himself to be confused at a wedding as to where he fits is the same question, or at least is the root of the question that we are all constantly asking ourselves, and that is, where do I fit in this world? What is my role? Who am I supposed to be? Now, the audience of Hebrews was obviously asking these very same questions. Now, if you guys are just joining us, if you haven't sort of gone back and checked out the other sermons that we've done on the book of Hebrews, Hebrews is a very, very confusing book. It's the type of book, and I won't say whether or not this is experience. It's a type of book that a pastor gets 3 chapters into and regrets entirely choosing for this sermon series. So here we are, we're right in the middle of it. I'm not really regretting, that was a joke, but this is a big empty room and you guys haven't laughed at anything yet. I feel very uncomfortable. Thank you for that. Yeah, good. Santa Claus here in the front row actually made me feel really comfortable. So, anyway, all that being said, Hebrews is a weird book. We don't know who wrote it. There's actually a lot of really competing and super interesting theories. For a while, it was thought that it was Paul, but recent scholarship is suggesting maybe that wasn't the case. It could have been this cool guy named Apollos, who just has an awesome name and barely gets mentioned in the Bible. Could have been this like awesome husband-wife duo, Priscilla and Aquila, which would be kind of cool. But we're not really sure. We have absolutely no idea. We also don't quite know who it was written to. But from context clues, it seems apparent that the book of Hebrews was actually written to Jewish believers who were following Jesus, right? So they were Jewish, maybe they grew up Jewish, maybe they were ethnically Jewish, they were whatever, they were Jewish. And then they started following Jesus. And a little while into that, at some point, they started facing some persecution, they started facing some difficulties and some challenges. And because of that, it made many of them consider, do we just go back to being Jewish? I mean, it's an official state religion. We won't be persecuted for it. Christianity still is showing up like a cult at this time in the Roman world. And so because of that, they were facing tons and tons of persecution. They started asking the question, where do we fit? And then they were asking the question that I know many of us have asked before, what does the Old Testament have to do with the New Testament? How do they fit together? And where do we fit into that grand story? And so, because of that, the author of Hebrews intentionally places them in the story. He gives them a location. He's saying, hey, this is where you fit. this is where you belong, and he does that in our passage today. So, what we have here is actually a metaphor. And this entire passage that we're looking at today is built around this singular metaphor. Basically, it breaks down like this. God is the builder, and I think we all have this up on the screen. We are the house. Moses was a servant, and Jesus is a son. So God is the builder. We are the house. Moses was a servant, and Jesus is a son. Now, I'm going to read through this passage again, so keep an eye out. Wow, that is massive. I didn't even realize until I turned around. That's huge! I love it. Anyway, keep an eye out for those 4 things. Therefore, holy brothers, you who share in the heavenly calling, consider Jesus the apostle and high priest of our confession, who was faithful to him who appointed him, just as Moses was also faithful in all God's house. For Jesus has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses, as much more glory as the builder of a house has more honor than the house itself. For every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. Now Moses was faithful in all God's house as a servant to testify to the things that were to be spoken later. But Christ is faithful over God's house as a son, and we are his house, if indeed we hold fast to our confidence and our boasting and our hope. The first takeaway here that I think will help us sort of answer these deeper existential questions is that what God is building is you. It says there that we are his house. Speaking of those who are followers of Jesus, and so if you would include yourself in that designation, then what God is building, what he is busy crafting, is actually you. Now it's really interesting here, the word house could be referring to an actual building, like what we would think of as a house, but it could also be referring to a household. And so what it could be here is, instead of God is building this building that is a house, it could be more in the sense of like God is sort of, he is creating, or he is establishing this household through what he is making. And that household, that building, that group is you. That is the church. That is his people. If you're a follower of God, you are a part of this household. Which is really, really fascinating, and explains why the author opens up this passage by calling them holy brothers who are part of the exact same calling. And I want you to think about this for a moment. Think about that what God is building, what God is creating, what he is establishing is actually you. That we are his house. Think on it for a moment. I think we tend to get it really confused. We tend to think that God has all of these strategic plans, this history-spanning thing that he does have. We tend to think of it as like, he is working hard to establish these different things. He's sort of like crossing off things on his to-do list. He's like, accomplishing goals. He's being strategic. He's, establishing this big organization. And instead it says here that we are actually what he is building. We are actually what he is working on. You and I, human beings, simple, frail, temporally short-living human beings are the thing that God is actually working on. It's what he's concerned about. We get really distracted when we start thinking about the church as this big sort of organization, this big strategy, this big plan, when really it has always been a group of people. It has always been people that God is working on and in and through to accomplish his purposes. It reminds me of when I was working one of my first jobs at a church when I was in college. And I remember I got called into the executive pastor's office, which is kind of like the principal of a big church, right? So he was the executive pastor, which means he just sort of gets stuff done. And I really was under the impression that the only reason I was coming in there is because I had been stealing food. Now, before you judge me too much for that, it wasn't like I was starving, so you can judge me a little. But basically what had happened is I was a poor college student. I was working as an intern, and I found out that if you ever got into a meeting with one of the bigwigs, right, like one of the big pastors, you'd go in there and they would say, "Hey, can I get you something?" Right? Like nice little meeting tactic, which means that somewhere in the chain of offices there was a machine, or a refrigerator, I guess you could call it, that had free Cokes in it and free snacks, right? And so me being poor college student, it was basically my lunch for the whole year that I was working there, and I was just 100% under the assumption that I was busted, because I'd have to kind of sneak around and kind of, get to it when I wasn't having a meeting and stuff like that. And so that's what I assumed that it was. Or at the very least, that we were going to talk some sort of like, strategic, high level, what's going to happen next with this organization talk. And instead, what happened is I sat down with the executive pastor, and he looked at me, and instead of, berating me for stealing, instead of, talking about what he wants me to do, he looks at me and he says, "So what do you want to be when you grow up?" And it started this relationship that sort of went on from there. And he sort of took me in, he mentored me, he discipled me, he sort of helped me to think about who I am. He was like the first person that I ever took a personality test with, right? Like he's sitting there saying like, I, as an older man in the church, want to help you find your place. I want to help you find where you fit in. I want to invest in you so that the future church might be blessed, so that it might be invested in. We talked about strengths and weaknesses. We talked about why he made the decisions that he made. He was able to sort of apprentice me through that. And the beautiful thing, the most amazing thing, is that relationship switched entirely from being about the church and about what it wanted to accomplish and about all the things that we needed to do. And instead, it became about me. Which I know sounds selfish, but isn't that kind of what we want from our relationships? Especially our closest, most meaningful relationships? We don't want to sit down and talk about accomplishing tasks and setting goals and all this other stuff. We want someone who cares about us, cares about who we are, cares about our hopes, cares about our dreams, and wants to help us to get there. And the beautiful thing is that's exactly what God does. When the author of Hebrews says that we are what he is building, we are what God is working on, this is exactly what it means. It means that God is invested in caring for, in loving, and in building you into the people that he needs us to be. But that's not the only thing that the author of Hebrews sort of tells us about this building. There is an if condition. Now, Hebrews is a really interesting book. There's a couple of things that we see in the book of Hebrews that we don't necessarily see in other places around Scripture, and it sort of creates this like fuller picture of a total theology of the whole Bible. He actually gives a condition here, and I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't actually point this out. And so if we can throw the text back there on the screen, it says, "And we are his house," down there at the bottom, "we are his house if we hold fast our confidence and our boasting in our hope." If we hold fast to our confidence and our boasting and our hope. Meaning that this being his house, being the people of God, does actually come with conditions. Now you may read that and immediately sort of react and sort of like, whoa, this doesn't make sense, this isn't right. I believe that there is nothing that you can do to earn your salvation. Salvation is not a conditional kind of thing, and that is 100% true. But actually what the author of Hebrews is hitting on here is something that I think is really useful and meaningful to the life of the church. And what he is saying here is that we will be able to tell who is the house of God, who is what he is building, by the way in which they live. Meaning that if we continue to have faith in what God has done, if we continue to believe, and even audibly, that's what the boasting is about, if we continue to believe that God, or we will have hope for what God will do, then it sort of shows our faith. It reveals who we are, reveals what we think and feel about God and the world. Again, I want to say you cannot earn your salvation. This is not some sort of like proof test where if you can just go and sort of manifest these qualities as much as you can, you'll prove that you're a Christian. Instead, they are actually the outpourings in the way in which a Christian should look. We are his house because we know it and we continue to act like it. Chuck Spurgeon says it this way. I don't know if I can call him Chuck, but he's dead. He's not going to bother me. So Charles Spurgeon says it this way. Men may be nominally Christ's, but they are not Christ's house unless they hold fast to the confidence and rejoicing of the hope firm until the end. Temporary Christians are not really Christians. Now, I think that's important. Not as some sort of like guilt-ridden, like, ooh, you better act right all the time. In fact, I think for as much as temporary Christians are not really Christians, I would say that consistently perfect all the time Christians are not really Christians, because those people don't exist except Jesus. But I'm not sure if you could call him a Christian. That's going to get you in some weird, like, a thought circle there. Anyway, I don't want to get lost on that. I do want to say that what this means is not necessarily that you have to be perfect all the time, that you can't even sort of slide back and have moments in your life where you are walking away from God. But what it does mean is that the sort of mark of Christianity is not some sort of momentary, I feel good about this one thing in this moment. It's not even some like, yeah, I was Christian for a year, but it wasn't really for me. It is something that is produced and even built by God over a lifetime. So, that is how you know that you're a part of the house of God that he is building, but there are other members of this household. So next we move on to Moses. Moses was a servant to that house. And I love this analogy. This actually answers one of the biggest questions that I think most of us have about Christianity. And it's sort of a question of what do we do with the Old Testament? And here what is happening is Moses is actually embodying much of the Old Testament because he's one of these like key figures, right? He's one of the main players in the Old Testament. You can really track a lot of the Old Testament by going from Adam to Abraham to Moses to David. Those are sort of like the four big guys. And so here, the author of Hebrews saying, hey, Moses was actually a servant to this same house, does two really important and amazing things. First, it sort of ties that bridge. And imagine, put yourself in the shoes of a Jewish believer living at this time who's saying, I grew up on Moses. I grew up learning about Abraham. I believe that David is the greatest king. And now the author of Hebrews is saying, yeah, Moses was great. Moses was very important to the building of this house. Moses was necessary. But he was just a servant to this house. He was just a servant. He was an aid to help this house get to where it needs to be. In fact, N.T. Wright says, and bear with me, this is going to get a little confusing. I'm going to mix a few different metaphors right here, okay? So N.T. Wright actually says this when he talks about the book of Hebrews. He says that the author of Hebrews does this amazing job of showing the relationship between the Old Testament and the New. He describes it this way. He says the Old Testament is like a scaffolding. And you would assemble the scaffolding, it would be the outward framework of the building that you're building. So the Old Testament would be the scaffolding, but what God was always building was fully enacted in Jesus. So what God was always making, what God used that scaffolding, that framework for, was this building. In the same way, Moses was a servant. He was bringing about this house that God was building. He was working for this house. This is important because it is actually contrasted with this idea that Jesus is actually the son of the house. Did you notice that in the passage? It says this in verse 5. Moses was faithful in all God's house as a servant to testify the things that were to be spoken later, but Christ is faithful over God's house as a son. Did you catch that? Moses was faithful in God's house, but Jesus is faithful over God's house. Do you see the crucial difference here? I mean, think about this in the way that a household works. I know many of you have lots of servants, and so you'll understand this. A servant works for the house, right? A servant is trying, and especially if you think of it in terms of like the household, a servant is trying to make sure that the household operates as best as it possibly can. He serves the house. He is there to sort of like make it function as well as it possibly can. But a son is different. The son doesn't work for the house works for the son, right? The son is the one that the house is being built for. The son is the one that the house is there to serve. The house exists to serve its owners, not the other way around. And if you remember, we are that house that God is building. We are what he is working on. And so to say that Jesus then is the son inside of that house means that, contrary to so much of our prideful belief, that we actually exist to serve him. That we actually exist to work towards his purposes just in the same way that a house exists to serve the people that are living in it, right? But we get it sort of backwards and the other way around. We want to think that our entire story is about us, that we're the most important thing that's ever happened to the universe, and that everything that we could possibly do to gain more freedom, control, authority, or power is actually going to suit us well, is actually going to make our lives richer and fuller. But the author of Hebrews here is saying something completely different. And he's saying something that's even more beautiful. That simultaneously, you can be the thing that God is building. That you can be the house that he is making. You can be his beloved and intentional and purposeful creation. And at the same time, your fullest joy, your most purpose and meaning in life is in locating yourself with Jesus as the Son, the Lord over that house that God is building. I've got one more example, and it's woefully pretentious. I'm sorry. All right, we're just going to go for it. I don't carry this knowledge around in my head. I had to Wikipedia it. I'm not this guy. This is I wrote it down. It's so snobby, but it's also so perfect. If you've ever seen the movie The Red Violin, this is actually sort of where this comes from. But anyway, there is actually a cello that was made a long time ago. The other reason why this analogy is important is because people don't think of themselves as houses, right? There's never a compliment when somebody's like, yeah, you're like a house, right? Like, that's not a good thing. So think of yourself like a cello in this story. In the year 1712, the Davidoff Stradivarius cello was built by Antonio Stradivari, right? We're already in the pretense. Just lean into it. It's okay. All right. We call it the Davidoff Stradivarius because it was given to a Russian guy named Davidoff nearly 100 years after it's built. And so these very famous cellos and violins and other string instruments like that were built around these times, they get names by the people that they sort of get attached to. And so very early on, this guy Davidoff, and I say early on, it's still 100 years after it was built, this guy Davidoff gets given this cello. Another great cellist was dying, and he says, I want you to have this cello. And so he gives it to Davidoff. Davidoff goes and plays it. He was actually called by Tchaikovsky? I can't even say that. This thing is too pretentious for me. What was it, Declan? Tchaikovsky. I got it. There it is. Thank you, sir. He was actually called the Tsar of the Cello by Tchaikovsky, right? So this guy Davidoff was like a huge deal, a big deal. Then, after he died, it was sold in Paris in 1888, and then it was sold in New York in 1928, and then, at that time, it was sold for $90,000 to a woman who bought it and anonymously gave it to her goddaughter. So this woman goes in, she buys this cello for $90,000 and gives it to her goddaughter, who at that time was like a 19-year-old prodigy in the cello, and her name was Jackie Dupree. Now, Jackie would play the instrument for a long time, and it was a very important time for her. She was growing in the cello scene, which I know you guys are all following pretty actively. And so she was playing the cello. It's interesting, it would later be said of Jackie that for as much as she loved this cello, as much as she played it, she actually never fully understood it. In fact, she came at it with too much passion. She didn't know how to work around this cello. She didn't know how to best sort of let this cello speak for itself. She was always sort of, working it too hard, trying to get things out of it that she couldn't. And so then, eventually, Jackie actually got multiple sclerosis and was no longer able to play the cello. And so the cello sat completely dormant for 12 whole years. For 12 years, this beautiful instrument, one of the greatest instruments of all time, was actually completely not used until Jackie invited a young man over to her house who got to play it for 15 minutes, and he said it was one of the greatest 15 minutes of his entire life. That actually meeting with this instrument, having starting this relationship with this instrument, if you want to call it that, was actually a transformative experience for it. This young man was Yo-Yo Ma, which now we've finally gotten around to the only cellist that anyone could possibly ever name. Mostly because his name is interesting, but also because he might be the most famous classical musician in the world. And so Yo-Yo Ma plays it for 15 minutes and then actually spends the next few years working to try and get to a place where he can play on this instrument. Even now, so this is one of his favorite instruments. He plays 2 cellos. This is one of them. Even now, he does not even own the cello. He has to sort of rent and borrow it from museums. I think technically it's owned by Louis Vuitton now because reasons. I don't know, right? It's super weird. And yet, some of the most beautiful music that has ever been created and recorded in the history of humanity is played by Yo-Yo Ma playing this very same cello. He said this about it. He said, there is a mysterious relationship between performer and instrument. Since 1983, the cello's sound has been growing constantly, becoming richer, deeper, and fuller. Part can be attributed to constant playing, causing it to vibrate more fully, but part may be due to my own changing aural aesthetics. He's recognizing here that this long, winding, weird journey that happened to this cello, that ended, or at least has, had this one stopping point with Yo-Yo Ma, has sort of resulted in this cello being morphed and changed and growing and transforming throughout time, so that it might one day land in the hands of a master like Yo-Yo Ma. that this beautiful instrument made by some guy in 1712 in Italy would cross to 3 different continents of the world, that it would travel around from hands to hands, that it would be played by numerous people, that one time actually Yo-Yo Ma left it in a cab in New York City and then somehow it made its way back to him. One time it was passing through an x-ray machine and the neck got broken off of it and then they had to fix it. That this crazy instrument would take this insane journey to get to Yo-Yo Ma to make some of the most beautiful music that has ever been played in the history of humanity. This cello here is you. That through the expert creation of God, that he is making you what you need to be, and that what you need to be is being held in the hands of a master performer, in the hands of Jesus. That simultaneously, through these weird and winding ways, 2 things collide at the back end, where you, being a creation of God, being the house that he has built by being his constant building, are actually, you find your most meaning and your most purpose in being held in the hands of the one who was always meant to guide you, who was always meant to be the sun in your house, who was always meant to be the master performer. And this is the heart of the gospel. And it's why so many of our analogies get so weird, because the world doesn't typically work this way. You are lovingly made by God. You could not be loved anymore. You could not be honored and cherished anymore. You are loved more than you will ever understand. You are loved more than any other human being, including yourself, even has the capacity to fathom. He is building you. You are his beloved creation, his art, his power, the very embodiment and image of himself. So on the one hand, you as a simple human being are incredibly highly honored and loved. But you find your true purpose and your true meaning only when Jesus becomes the ruler of your house. Only when he becomes the son who is lording over your house. And in discovering this, you find who you are always meant to be. Now, for some of you, you may be exploring or discovering that for the very first time today, and we would love to be alongside you for that. We would love to sort of talk through and tease through and explore that alongside you and with you. For others of you who would call yourselves followers of Jesus, this may be something that I think is one of these just sort of crucial balances that is difficult to navigate through life. Constantly our pride and our own identity and our own crying out for self-worth and for freedom and power sort of stands up so that we say, hey, I'm important, I am made by God. And then constantly at the same time, Jesus is coming in and saying, you are most important, you are most meaningful, you are most purposeful when you are living life in me. My challenge to you today is to spend some intentional time, spend some time thinking, spend some time dreaming, spend some time exploring what it looks like to be lovingly and craftingly and carefully made so that you would be the house of God for his purpose and for his designs. And find out what it means to find that true purpose and meaning and identity in Jesus being Lord over your life. Would you guys pray with me? Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you. God, we thank you that you have made us. God, for as broken and feeble as we often feel, for as simple and insignificant as we seem to ourselves at times, God, that you love us and you have made us and we are your house that you are building, God. God, teach us. Teach us how to find joy and satisfaction and life in being defined by your Son. And being defined by his lordship over ourselves. God, we love you, and we thank you for loving us. It's in Jesus' name we pray.